You know, I was almost expecting John Bachman to go into that Bill Murray. It looks like it's in the hole.
It's in the hole.
With
Who
that whole
doesn't
thing.
love that movie, right?
Well, Caddyshack aside, welcome into hour 3 of America's Forum here on Newsmax TV with Miranda Kahn, J.D. Hayworth. And Miranda, we've got big news.
Speaking of a big golfer.
That's right. President Obama, his approval rating is soaring. Only problem for our chief executive, it's in Cuba, where people there are pleased with him. According to a new Fusion poll, look at the top two numbers. Very positive opinion, 34%. Somewhat positive, 46%. You put them together, that's 80%.
Yeah, and all those numbers just blow Raul Castro out of the water. 8% of the Cuban people hold a very positive opinion of him.
And things are even worse for his big brother Fidel Castro. Castro holds a very positive opinion with only 11% of his countrymen. Let's go in depth on this poll that had to be conducted, I guess, somewhat surreptitiously, given the fact that Cuba remains a communist country. We're so pleased to welcome to our anchor desk once again Raul Mas, community activist, analyst, and commentator. This polling, it's really very interesting.
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, it was done surreptitiously. The firm that did it is perhaps not a well-known national firm, but it's actually a fairly well-known polling outfit in South Florida that has been around for quite some period of time. They went to the island. They actually polled, I believe the number was over 2,000 individuals. The margin of error is somewhat around 4 or 5%. So it's actually a pretty, I think, good poll of the sense of what's going on in Cuba. I think it's the first time it's ever been done, obviously, because it is Cuba. And one of the interesting things about the poll is that only more than 75% of the people said that they felt uncomfortable even being polled. So you have to sort of wonder that if some of the revelations that came out of this poll had been done in a freer environment, they may have actually looked worse, quite frankly. But a lot of people still express, for all the right reasons, a certain amount of reticence in speaking freely about how they feel within the island of Cuba.
Are you surprised at all by these numbers?
No, not at all. I mean, obviously, look, what I think Americans need to understand is that people are still fleeing from Cuba. I mean, there are still people trying to get out, even as this president is making a push to sort of open up relations with the island, reestablish normal diplomatic relations. I mean, the Cuban people love him for that. But let me tell you, I see them all the time. I mean, there are people still leaving in droves any which way they can out of the island.
Now, you said something about it. People love him for that, you just said.
Yes.
And for those of us who've run for public office and as a recovering congressman, I take a look at polling and I wonder how it stacks up for other guys. For example, do you believe a George W. Bush or a Bill Clinton would have polled as well in Cuba?
Look, I don't know. I mean, you know, one of the things, I doubt it. I mean, in this case, obviously, I think there's sort of a recognition that Obama's been the one that basically has broken down that barrier in terms of the embargo on Cuba, or the attempt to break down the embargo on Cuba, I should say. So I think, obviously, he's viewed in a much more favorable light. But, you know, listen, Cubans on the island are still suffering enormously. There is an incredible shortage of food. I mean, the biggest thing in the poll was that their main concern is not even really politics, it's economics. It's how do I improve my condition? How do I feed myself and my family? Still remains a top priority for the Cuban people.
Let's talk about the Summit of Americas, which begins tomorrow.
Correct.
What do you anticipate happening? This is Cuba's first time there. President Obama's going to be there. Raul's going to be there. What do you anticipate?
Yeah, I think the big thing that everybody's expecting is you're going to see President Obama shake hands with Raul Castro. That's going to be sort of the golden moment of the whole summit. The president, I believe, yesterday lifted or removed, the State Department basically said that it planned to remove Cuba from the list of state sponsors of terrorism. Congress now has 45 days, I believe, to sort of act on that recommendation. We'll see what happens there. But the president is obviously moving along to try and reestablish normal diplomatic relations with Cuba, to establish a diplomatic presence. I think it's part of what he wants to be, you know, remembered for. And I think, you know, Raul Castro is happy to sort of go along.
About 30 seconds remain. We should note just a second ago we saw that handshake that arguably started this all with at the service for Nelson Mandela. How badly do you think President Obama wants the deal with Cuba? Bad enough to bend over backwards like we're seeing in the Iranian talks?
Listen, I think we already are bending over backwards. I mean, if you think about it, you know, if you look, for example, at American relations with China, or you look at American relations with Iran, I mean, Iran basically is on the verge of getting nuclear weapons. It's understandable to a certain extent that we would be in negotiations with them. But the United States really has nothing to fear from Cuba. I mean, it's a relatively small island. The biggest thing that Fidel Castro could do to us would be to flood us again with sort of another Mario.
Something's happening. We're out of time, but we're coming back. More with Raul right after this. Alongside Miranda Kahn, J.D. Hayworth back with you on America's Forum, and we are very pleased to continue our conversation here on the anchor desk with Raul Mas. And the subject right now, the relationship between the United States and Cuba. Now, Raul, there's a very interesting thing going on. The LA Times featured an op-ed piece, and this is what that particular column had to say. It says, what could have been a victory lap for President Obama is tainted by the sanctions the administration introduced on Venezuela. These sanctions labeled Venezuela an extraordinary national security threat to the United States. So, Raul, in view of that, putting sanctions on Venezuela, was that ill-advised by the administration?
No, listen, I mean, Venezuela has been doing all sorts of things that, quite frankly, require not just a slap on the hand, but quite frankly, more than a slap on the hand. They have been following the same model that Cuba has used historically, and in fact, you know, most people will tell you that Cuba is completely infiltrated by Cuban intelligence agents who are supporting the Maduro regime in Venezuela. They basically jailed, you know, the principal opposition leader. You know, there's been all sorts of, you know, shootings of civilians in the streets. I mean, the situation in Venezuela is deteriorating very rapidly. And obviously the corruption is absolutely endemic. I mean, there was a story a couple weeks ago where the Venezuelan Petroleum Company basically has been shuttling literally millions and millions of dollars out of the country to line the pockets of all the Venezuelan politicians. So, you know, what's ironic is you've got a situation where we're saying, okay, Cuba's fine, but Venezuela is, you know, on our nasty list, okay? And I mean, they basically are both joined at the hip.
Right.
And Cuba depends enormously on the oil subsidy that they receive from Venezuela. I mean, Latin American observers who are looking at this are just sort of scratching their heads saying, how can you on the one hand be saying that things are okay in Cuba and it's okay for us to deal with them, and on the other hand, Venezuela, who's basically their twin brother, you're saying is a national security risk. I mean, that makes absolutely no sense to any sort of impartial observer, I would argue, of what's going on in Latin America.
Well, there's talk about taking Cuba off the terror list.
Mm-hmm.
They had talked about doing that prior to the summit that's going on right now. They also talked about putting embassies there.
Yeah, well, they have to take Cuba off the terror list in order to be able to open up the embassies. And more importantly, from Cuba's perspective, by getting off the terror list, it allows them now to begin to have access to the international financial community, to the IMF, to the international banks, because quite frankly, if you're on the United States' hit list in terms of being a state sponsor of terror, no financial institution in the world will touch you. So that's why Cuba is so anxious to get off of that state sponsor of terror list, because it allows them to then access capital, badly needed capital that they need to maintain themselves in power.
Raul, you've got about 2.5 minutes remaining.
Yes,
Let's switch gears to another topic very much in the news on our parent website, Newsmax.com, and that is a year after the VA healthcare scandal broke into our collective consciousness, there really hasn't been a change in wait times.
Right.
What do you think ought to be done?
Listen, I mean, as I mentioned to you during the break, I mean, I've done an enormous amount of work with veterans over the years in a variety of different sort of voluntary capacities in South Florida. You know, the VA is just the most dysfunctional government agency that I've ever witnessed. I mean, first of all, people don't understand exactly how big the VA is. I mean, it's absolutely enormous. Trying to change things at VA is akin to sort of trying to turn around an aircraft carrier that's going full steam. It takes a long, long time. There is an enormous amount of bureaucratic inertia. some of the rules and regulations, which Congress has now changed, basically for the longest time didn't allow you to fire anybody. So how can you change an organization where the people who run the organization are still there? There are some folks that argue that we just need to completely do away with the VA and find a new model for taking care of our veterans.
Are you among those people?
You know what? I'm starting to fall into that camp just because I've seen, when you hear stories like this, you just say to yourself, maybe there's a better way to do this, man. Maybe there's a way that we can sort of not entirely privatize the care, but we can take huge chunks of what the VA does for our veterans and let the private sector take a shot at it and see if they can't do it better. I mean, you've seen, you know, when we had the whole healthcare Obama, how long it took to set up a website, for Christ's sakes. That same mentality exists at the VA. Everything is done and approved by multiple committees, and it's a shame. I think those numbers that now appear to be worse,
right.
You got to ask yourself whether the original numbers were accurate to begin with.
Right.
So now maybe we're actually seeing
because those wait
how
times
bad
weren't
the thing
accurate
is.
before.
Exactly.
So,
Exactly.
yeah.
People were fudging those.
Well, my real takeaway, Raul, from this discussion on the VA,
You just
you
got an
talked about
idea.
Obamacare
Yes.
and the wait time, just a whole website. So many on the left held up the VA healthcare system of the model of government efficiency in the pre-scandal days dealing with healthcare. So what that means for healthcare in the future, not only for the vets, but for us all, it could
I
be a
think
real
you'll
challenge.
find very few veterans that will tell you that the VA is a model of just about anything, quite frankly.
And on that note, Raul Mas, you have our thanks, and America's Forum will be right back after